The plasma mind did not make a sound. That was the detail Rayeth would remember later, when the memory replayed itself in the hours between sleep and waking with the fidelity that trauma imposed on moments it considered important enough to preserve in full resolution. There was no warning, no click, no hiss, no mechanical prelude that might have given her nervous system the fraction of a second it needed to convert awareness into evasion. One step she was whole. The next step the ground beneath her became light and heat, and a pressure wave that translated, through the medium of her body, into an experience that her training had prepared her for theoretically, and that theory had failed to capture in any way that was useful now. She hit the volcanic scree on her back. The sky above the Ashenvale corridor was the color of old bruises, gray-violet, heavy with the particulate haze that Kethara Voss's atmosphere carried permanently, the geological exhaust of a planet that had been volcanically active for longer than most civilizations had existed. She stared at it and processed, with the clinical detachment that her combat conditioning installed between the event and the emotional response, the information her body was sending. Both legs severed below mid-thigh, cauterized by plasma heat. Blood loss minimal due to the thermal sealing, but shock advancing with the systematic inevitability of a system, recognizing that significant components were no longer attached. Rayeth was Selvari. She was 31 by her species' developmental markers, which mapped roughly to a human in their late 20s in terms of physical maturity, and approximately 2 centuries ahead in terms of how long her civilization had been telling its soldiers that this was the price of service, and that the price was worth paying. She was tall, 6 feet, lean, built with the dense, efficient musculature of a species whose warrior caste had been selectively developed across 800 years of military tradition, into something that balanced power and endurance, with an economy that human kinesiologists found fascinating and human soldiers found intimidating. Her skin was a deep slate gray with subtle blue undertones, carrying the matte finish that Selvari pigmentation produced, a surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, evolved for environments where visibility was a liability. Her eyes were sharp ice blue, pale against the darkness of her skin, with pupils that contracted to narrow points in bright light and expanded to wide circles in darkness, giving her a range of visual acuity that operated across conditions humans would classify as both daylight and near-total blackness. Along the outer edges of her eyes and tracing back toward her temples, fine raised ridges of bone followed the contour of her skull, sensory structures that detected vibration and pressure changes, giving her species an awareness of spatial dynamics that functioned like a sixth sense, and that made them exceptionally difficult to ambush, which made the plasma mind's success a testament to how well it had been placed. Her hair was white-silver, cropped close to her skull in the military standard, and along her jaw and the sides of her neck. Thin lines of bioluminescent tissue pulsed in rhythms that corresponded to her physiological state. Currently, a rapid, flickering pale blue that her squad members, watching from the positions they had scattered to when the mine detonated, recognized as the Selvari body's signal for critical injury under conscious management. Sergeant First Class Nate Garrett reached her 40 seconds after the blast. He came around the corridor's bend at a run, his medical pack bouncing against his hip, his boots finding purchase on the volcanic scree with the practiced confidence of someone who had crossed hostile terrain under worse conditions, and whose body treated urgency as a gear to shift into rather than an emergency to panic about. He was 28, medium height, built with the compact functionality of a field medic, whose fitness was a byproduct of carrying heavy equipment to bad places quickly rather than any deliberate aesthetic pursuit. His face was the kind that settled into focused competence under stress, brown eyes that narrowed when they assessed and widened when they calculated, a jaw that set itself when decisions needed making, and an expression that communicated, to anyone familiar with combat medics, that this person was already working on the problem before his hands reached the patient. He dropped beside her, His eyes went to her legs, to where her legs had been, and the assessment took less than 2 seconds because Nate Garrett had seen plasma injuries before, and the visual vocabulary of thermal amputation was, unfortunately, one he was fluent in. Lieutenant Commander. His voice was calm in the specific way that medic voices were calm, the practiced modulation that said I am not alarmed, and therefore you should not be alarmed, which was technically a lie because he was alarmed but functionally a tool because the lie worked. I'm going to stabilize you, stay with me. My legs are gone, Sergeant, Rayeth said, and her voice carried the flat, controlled tonality of a Selvari warrior, processing catastrophic information through the framework she had been trained to use, which involved acknowledging reality, categorizing it, and storing the emotional response in a compartment that would be opened later in private, where no one could see the compartment's contents. I can see that, Nate said, already working. We're going to deal with the immediate situation first and the long-term situation after. He did not know, in that moment, what the long-term situation would involve. He did not know that Selvari medical technology could not rebuild limbs. He did not know that Selvari culture prohibited prosthetics. He did not know that the woman whose stumps he was treating with the focused efficiency of a professional doing what he was trained to do had just, by every standard her civilization maintained, lost not only her legs but her identity. He would learn all of this within 24 hours, and he would disagree with every part of it. The forward operating base's medical wing processed Rayeth with the grim efficiency of a system designed for exactly this kind of outcome. The Selvari medical team confirmed the diagnosis in terminology that was clinical in structure and final in implication. Bilateral transfemoral amputation, plasma cauterized, regeneration protocols inapplicable due to limb complexity exceeding current regenerative capability thresholds. The translation, stripped of medical language, was simple. They could not grow her legs back, and there was nothing else to discuss. Except there was, and the thing there was to discuss was cultural rather than medical. And it was the part that Nate Garrett could not stop thinking about as he sat in the maintenance bay adjacent to the medical wing, cleaning his equipment and listening through the thin partition wall to the sounds of a civilization telling a soldier her career was over. The Selvari ritual of farewell was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was performed with the same disciplined restraint that characterized everything the Selvari warrior caste did, which meant it was quiet and precise and devastating in the way that quiet, precise things are devastating when you understand what they mean. Her commanding officer spoke words that Nate's translator rendered as a formal acknowledgement of sacrifice and transition. Her unit members entered the medical bay one at a time, each performing a gesture that involved pressing their palm to their own chest and then extending it toward her. A transfer of respect, a goodbye conducted in the language of bodies rather than words. The administrative documentation had already begun. Rayeth Vorselin, Lieutenant Commander, 3rd Assault Corps, was being reclassified from warrior to civilian, and the distance between those two categories in Selvari culture was not a step but a chasm, and the chasm was permanent. Nate sat in the maintenance bay and listened to all of it, and the thing that grew in his chest was not anger exactly, but the specific, focused dissatisfaction of a medic who had been told that his patient's problem was solved when his patient's problem was, by any reasonable assessment, still very much active. He began looking at parts. The maintenance bay was full of them. Combat exoskeletons damaged in the field, stripped for components, awaiting transport to repair facilities that were perpetually backlogged. Hydraulic actuators, joint assemblies, neural interface modules that translated biological nerve signals into mechanical movement, technology that humans had been refining for decades, and that formed the basis of every prosthetic limb in the human military medical catalog. Nate was not a prosthetic engineer. He was a field medic, but field medics, by the nature of their work, were improvisers. They operated in environments where the proper equipment was always somewhere else, and the patient was always right here. And the gap between those two facts was bridged by creativity, determination, and a willingness to use whatever was available in ways its designers had not intended. He pulled up Selvari neural architecture on his medical database. He cross-referenced it with human prosthetic interface specifications. The compatibility was not perfect, but it was closer than he expected. Selvari neural pathways operated on frequencies that human interface technology could approximate with modification, and the modification required was within the range of what he could accomplish with the tools in the maintenance bay and the training he carried in his hands. He worked through the night. He did not request authorization because authorization would be denied. He did not consult the Selvari medical team because consulting them would trigger the cultural prohibition protocols that would shut the project down before it started. He worked alone, in a maintenance bay that smelled like hydraulic fluid and scorched metal, assembling something that was not elegant and was not beautiful and was not approved by any authority in either military, and that was designed to do one thing: give a soldier back her legs. By morning he had a prototype. 2 prosthetic legs built from exoskeleton components, fitted with modified neural interfaces, designed to attach to the biological structures above Rayeth's amputation sites, and to translate her nervous system's movement commands into mechanical response. They were angular, visibly mechanical, carrying the aesthetic of combat equipment repurposed rather than medical devices designed. They looked like what they were: spare parts and determination, assembled by a man who did not accept the phrase, "can't be fixed," as a final answer. He went to Rayeth's medical bay. She was awake. Selvari warriors did not sleep well in medical facilities, a trait she shared with human soldiers, and the commonality was one of the small recognitions that had built a professional respect between them during their months of joint service. She lay on the medical platform with the rigid stillness of someone who was holding their composure in place through muscular effort, and her ice-blue eyes found him in the doorway with the flat, assessing gaze of a warrior who was cataloging everyone who entered her space out of habit rather than expectation. "I need to ask you something," Nate said, "and I need the answer to come from you, not from your regulations." Her bioluminescent lines shifted, a flicker of pale blue against slate-gray skin, curiosity threading through the injury management rhythm. "Do you want to walk again?" The answer came before her training could intercept it. It rose from somewhere below the cultural conditioning and the warrior doctrine, and the 800 years of tradition that said a broken instrument was to be set aside with honor. And it arrived in her eyes before it arrived in her voice, a flash in the ice-blue irises, a dilation of the pupils, the involuntary physical response of a body that had been asked whether it wanted to be whole, and that did not consult the culture before answering. "Yes," Rayeth said. "The restoration took 3 days." Nate worked in the maintenance bay because the maintenance bay was not subject to medical wing oversight protocols, and because the maintenance staff, a mixed human Selvari crew whose primary concern was keeping equipment functional rather than culturally compliant, looked at what he was doing with the pragmatic assessment of people who understood tools and saw a man using tools to solve a problem, which was, in their professional opinion, what tools were for. The first day was surgical. Nate attached the prosthetic interface points to Rayeth's residual limbs, a procedure that required the kind of precise, steady-handed work that field medics developed through years of performing complex medical tasks in environments where the ground was shaking, and the patient was conscious, and the lighting was whatever your headlamp could provide. Rayeth remained awake throughout, by choice, watching him work on her body with the focused attention of a warrior observing a procedure she did not fully understand but had decided to trust. And the trust was based not on cultural framework or institutional authority, but on the simpler, older calculus of one person reading another person's competence and finding it sufficient. The second day was calibration. The neural interfaces activated, and the moment when Rayeth's nervous system first connected to the cybernetic legs produced an expression on her face that Nate would remember for the rest of his life. The sudden, involuntary widening of ice blue eyes as signals that had been traveling to destinations that no longer existed suddenly found new recipients, as phantom limbs became actual limbs. As the body's map of itself was redrawn in real time to include structures that were metal and hydraulic fluid and circuits instead of bone and muscle and blood, but that responded to the same commands and carried the same weight and did the same fundamental thing. Moved when she told them to move, she stood on the second day. The first steps were unsteady, the gait of someone learning a new instrument, and Nate watched her cross the maintenance bay with one hand extended toward the wall for balance and the other clenched at her side, in a fist that was not frustration but concentration, the absolute, total focus of a woman who was walking, and who had been told she would never walk again, and who was, with each step, dismantling the certainty that had been presented to her as permanent. By the third day she was running, not jogging, not testing, running, with the full stride power of a warrior caste soldier whose body had spent a lifetime learning how to move efficiently through hostile terrain, and whose legs, new and mechanical and unauthorized, responded with a speed and force that the biological originals had not possessed. The exoskeleton components that Nate had repurposed were built for combat loads. The hydraulic actuators generated more force than organic muscle. The joint assemblies operated with mechanical precision that biological joints, with their cartilage and tendons and susceptibility to fatigue, could not match. Rayeth Vorselin, by Selvari medical assessment, was a permanently disabled veteran preparing for administrative exile. By the diagnostic metrics that Nate ran on the third day, she was a combat-effective soldier whose physical capability exceeded her pre-injury baseline by measurable margins. She stood in the maintenance bay on legs that her culture called blasphemy and looked at her hands, her real hands, biological, unchanged, and then at her legs, mechanical, angular, humming with the faint vibration of systems operating within normal parameters. And the bioluminescent lines along her jaw pulsed in a color that Nate had never seen from her before. Not the pale blue of injury management, not the steady silver of combat readiness. Something warmer, something that looked, in the maintenance bay's utilitarian lighting, like the first light of a morning after a night that was not supposed to end. "These are not my legs," she said. "No," Nate agreed. "They're better." The tribunal convened in the forward operating base's briefing room, because the base did not have a formal judicial chamber, and because the Selvari military, despite its elaborate cultural protocols, was ultimately a practical institution that understood tribunals happened where space was available rather than where tradition preferred. The room was functional, unadorned, lit by overhead panels that cast the even, shadowless light that military installations used because shadows were inefficient, and the military distrusted inefficiency, the way most people distrusted snakes. 3 Selvari officers sat behind a field desk. Commander Theron Vordave, Rayeth's direct superior, whose expression carried the rigid neutrality of a man who had been ordered to conduct a proceeding, whose outcome was predetermined by the law he was sworn to enforce. A Dominion legal advocate whose name Nate's translator rendered as something unpronounceable, and whose function was to ensure procedural compliance. And a cultural doctrine specialist whose presence indicated that this was not a military hearing but a cultural one, and that the stakes were not tactical but existential. Rayeth sat in the respondent's position. She had walked there. The sound of her mechanical legs on the briefing room's metal floor, a rhythmic, precise cadence that was not the sound of biological footsteps, but was unmistakably the sound of someone walking with purpose, had caused every Selvari in the room to look at her, and then look away and then look back, because what they were seeing could not be reconciled with what they believed, and the dissonance was physical. She was in her duty uniform. The uniform fit as it always had above the waist, standard Selvari military dress, clean and correct, rank insignia in place. Below the waist the prosthetics were visible, angular, mechanical. They did not pretend to be biological. They did not hide behind cosmetic coverings. They were what they were: combat exoskeleton components, repurposed and rebuilt, carrying the aesthetic of functional engineering rather than medical disguise. They were, by Selvari cultural doctrine, an abomination visible to every person in the room. The cultural doctrine specialist spoke first. The augmentation of a warrior's body with mechanical components constituted desecration of biological wholeness under the Code of Martial Integrity, Section 12, Subsection 4. The code was 800 years old. It had been written in a period when the Selvari warrior caste defined itself through the purity of the biological instrument, and it had been maintained across the centuries without amendment because the Selvari had never encountered a reason to amend it. A warrior was their body. When the body was broken beyond biological repair, the warrior's identity ended. This was not cruelty. It was structure. It was the architecture on which 800 years of military tradition had been built. Rayeth was to be dishonorably discharged. Her rank was to be stripped. Her warrior caste standing was to be revoked permanently. The prosthetics were to be removed. Nate Garrett was summoned. He entered the briefing room in his field uniform, which carried the stains and wear of a medic who had been working in a maintenance bay for 3 days and who had not prioritized laundry over his patient. He stood before the tribunal with the posture of a man who was accustomed to standing in rooms where people with authority told him what was and was not acceptable, and who had developed, over 7 years of field medicine, a professional relationship with authority that could best be described as respectful disagreement. The legal advocate presented the charges: unauthorized medical procedure, cultural interference under joint operational protocol, violation of Selvari bodily integrity doctrine through the application of mechanical augmentation to a Selvari military citizen without Dominion authorization. Nate listened. He listened the way he listened to patient briefings, completely, without interruption, cataloging the information and assessing it against his own framework. When the advocate finished, the tribunal invited his response. "She lost her legs," Nate said. "I fixed them, that's the whole story. You violated the Code of Martial Integrity. I don't recognize the Code of Martial Integrity as having authority over a medical decision." The cultural doctrine specialist leaned forward. "The code governs all modifications to Selvari warrior biology. You are operating under a joint protocol that requires respect for Selvari cultural." "I respect her culture," Nate said. "I do not respect any part of any culture that takes a soldier who can fight, a soldier who wants to fight, and tells her she's finished because the method of repair doesn't match tradition. She lost her legs to a plasma mine. I built her new ones from parts that were sitting in a maintenance bay doing nothing. And now she can walk and run and fight better than she could before. And you're telling me that's a crime because the legs are made of metal instead of bone." He looked at the tribunal with the direct, unblinking focus of a man who had made his decision before entering the room and who was not seeking the tribunal's agreement but informing them of reality. "I'm a medic. My job is to fix soldiers. I don't distinguish between healing and repair and augmentation and modification. Those are all the same word to me. The only word that matters is functional. Is the patient functional? She is. My job is done." The briefing room was silent. Commander Theron's expression had not changed, but his ice-blue eyes had shifted to Rayeth with an attention that went beyond procedural obligation. The cultural doctrine specialist's bioluminescent lines were cycling through colors that indicated rapid cognitive processing. The legal advocate was staring at his documentation, as though hoping it contained a provision he had not yet discovered. Rayeth stood. The sound of her mechanical legs engaging, the soft hydraulic hiss, the precise click of joint assemblies locking into weight-bearing configuration, filled the silence with a statement that no oral argument could have made more effectively. She stood tall, straight, in her duty uniform with her rank insignia, and her prosthetic legs, and her ice-blue eyes carrying an expression that the tribunal recognized because they were warriors too. And the expression was the one that warriors wore when they had made a decision that could not be reversed. "The code says I am desecrated," she said. Her voice was steady, her Selvari harmonics carrying the formal register of someone addressing authority. "The code says these legs make me less than what I was. The code is wrong." The bioluminescent lines along her jaw pulsed, not the pale blue of injury, not the silver of readiness, but the color Nate had seen in the maintenance bay, warm and steady and new. "I am a warrior. I was a warrior before the mine, and I am a warrior now. The only thing that has changed is the material, and material does not define the warrior. Function does, purpose does. The willingness to stand when standing costs you everything, that defines the warrior. And I am standing." The tribunal did not overturn the code. The code was 800 years old, and 3 officers in a briefing room on a border world did not have the authority to amend it. But Commander Theron, exercising the discretionary judgment that field commanders possessed for situations that fell outside established protocol, transferred Rayeth's service classification from Selvari Dominion jurisdiction to Joint Task Force Operational Command, a lateral move that placed her outside the code's authority without formally challenging it. The cultural doctrine specialist objected. Theron noted the objection. The objection changed nothing because the transfer was within his operational authority, and because Theron, who had watched Rayeth serve under his command for 4 years, and who had presided over her farewell ritual with the hidden anguish of a commander losing his best officer, was not going to watch her be discharged twice. Rayeth walked out of the briefing room on legs that her culture called blasphemy, and that her body called hers. Nate walked beside her, carrying his medical pack, his field uniform still stained with hydraulic fluid and the particular residue that came from working with salvaged exoskeleton components for 3 consecutive days. "Thank you," she said. The word was simple. The harmonic undertone was not. It carried frequencies that Nate's translator processed slowly and rendered with the tentativeness of a system encountering emotional data it did not have full context for. And what it returned was a complex layering of gratitude, recognition, and something that the Selvari emotional lexicon classified as the acknowledgement of a debt that could not be repaid, because what was given exceeded what any framework could quantify. "You don't owe me anything," Nate said. "You lost your legs, not your ability to fight, so I fixed the legs. The rest is paperwork." Rayeth looked at him. Her ice-blue eyes, the eyes of a warrior who had been told she was finished, and who was now standing on proof that she was not, held his brown ones with the intensity of someone seeing clearly for the first time, not because her vision had changed, but because the thing she was looking at was something her culture had taught her did not exist. A person who saw a broken warrior, and, instead of performing the ritual of farewell, simply picked up the available tools and went to work. The bioluminescent lines along her jaw pulsed warm and steady, and she turned and walked toward the base's operational center, her mechanical legs carrying her with a stride that was precise and powerful in hers. And Nate watched her go and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a medic whose patient was walking, and who did not require anything more than that to know the job was done. Outside, Cathara Voss's volcanic plain stretched to the horizon under a bruise-colored sky, and the Joint Task Force's patrols continued their sweeps through the Ashenvale corridor. And somewhere in the administrative channels of the Selvari Dominion, a cultural doctrine specialist was filing a formal objection that would be received, processed, and buried in the particular bureaucratic sediment that accumulated around decisions that institutions did not want to reverse, but could not publicly endorse. And on the base's training ground, visible through the operational center's windows, a Selvari warrior ran. She ran on legs of metal and hydraulic fluid and circuits, legs built from spare parts by a human who did not believe in the word impossible. And she ran faster than she had ever run before. And the sound of her stride on the volcanic ground was new and mechanical and strong. And it was the sound of someone who had been told the instrument was broken, discovering that the instrument had simply been rebuilt, and that the music it made now was not the same as before but was no less powerful, no less precise, and no less hers.